As the surf crashed against the shore, I noticed a dog sprinting along the water's edge, barking frantically. It suddenly veered inland, racing past me, unscathed yet visibly terrified. I couldn't help but wonder how it had survived the relentless barrage of American bombs and shells that had rocked this beach all morning. Our Navy ships and artillery had pounded the island for 3 days straight, starting with a relentless pre-dawn bombardment on D-Day and continuing until the first amphibious vehicles neared shore. If this dog had made it through such a deadly onslaught without a scratch, I thought, then what about the Japanese soldiers? Were there many still waiting ahead, lying in ambush? My question was quickly answered. A short distance away, I saw a group of Japanese soldiers scrambling behind a rocky outcrop, working frantically to position a 75mm field gun to fire at the waves of Marines landing on the beach. I felt a chill as I tried the radio, hoping to call in artillery support, but once again it was nothing but dead air. I shouted into it, desperate, but got no response. Just then, one of my platoon mates yelled, "Hey Mac, there's one of our tanks coming this way." Turning around, I spotted an amphibious tank lumbering toward us, its 75mm cannon protruding from the turret. "Thank God," I muttered. The tank commander stopped next to me, shouting, "We're looking for the 7th Marines." "They're not in this sector," I shouted back, pointing toward the Japanese gun. "But stay with us. We could use some help with that 75. The commander nodded and signaled to his gunner. Within seconds, the tank's cannon roared, sending a round straight into the Japanese field piece, flipping it over with a fiery explosion. The tank fired again, sending debris and enemy soldiers flying. As the surviving Japanese tried to flee, a group of us opened fire, our M1s taking them down before they could reach cover. Moving cautiously, we advanced toward the wrecked gun, prepared to finish off any remaining enemies. None moved. I nodded a grateful salute to the tank commander, who waved and rumbled away. Our objective here on Peleliu was clear: to seize the island's airfield, a mission similar to previous campaigns at Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester. Our orders were to secure the airfield and eliminate any Japanese forces defending it by nightfall. However, the fierce resistance made it apparent that this goal was overly ambitious. The airfield's edge, facing us from the seaward side, was only about 300 yards from the beach, and the field itself was half a mile wide. On the map, it hadn't seemed like much, a mere half-mile push with just a few hundred yards to cover from shore. General Rupertus had even expected us to take the entire island within 2 or 3 days, but no one told us that beyond the airfield lay steep ridges bristling with Japanese artillery, all precisely zeroed in on the open field and the beach below. We found ourselves bogged down, and some of the 5th Marines had accidentally strayed into the 7th Marines' territory. To our left, Colonel Chesty Puller, now leading the 1st Marines, was in dire straits on the rocky white beaches. His battalion had been tasked with supporting our advance, but they were battling just to avoid being pushed back into the sea. Hundreds of casualties had been reported, with some companies pinned down on the beach, while others clung to a precarious piece of high ground known as the Point. Once we moved past the beach, the ground beneath us was solid coral, making it impossible to dig foxholes for cover. The only protection was the occasional scrub bush or low outcrop of coral, hardly enough to shield us from enemy fire. A few men managed to find rocks to huddle behind, but many of us were left exposed, scrambling for cover as best we could. Yet the airfield itself promised to be the ultimate challenge. With nothing but a few shell holes and the remains of downed Japanese planes, it offered no protection. When we made the final push across, we'd be sitting ducks, like clay pigeons in a shooting gallery. That's why when Lieutenant B. Med informed me we'd been ordered to hold our position until dawn, I felt a surge of relief. At least we had one night to regroup. They'd warned us about the heat on Peleliu, but nothing could have prepared us for the oppressive 115-degree Fahrenheit temperatures by mid-afternoon on D-Day. The intense heat was merciless, and the only way to survive it was to stay hydrated. But water was in short supply, and we had a long, brutal fight ahead of us. In the blistering heat, each Marine had come ashore with 2 quart-sized canteens filled to the brim. It wasn't enough. By midday, as temperatures climbed past 115 degrees Fahrenheit, many of the men had drained their first canteen and were dipping heavily into the second, hoping for a resupply that never came. The reality of the intense heat and the lack of water was settling in, but there was little time to worry. By afternoon, instead of the anticipated banzai charge, a column of 13 Japanese light tanks rolled across the airfield, supported by over 500 infantry. They aimed to exploit a gap between the 5th Marines battalions, hoping to punch through and push our forces back onto the beach. With our tanks thinned out by artillery during the morning's landings, it seemed the Japanese believed we had no armor left to counter their advance. Fortunately, they were wrong. Positioned just 50 yards from Major Gordon Gale's command post were Sherman tanks from Colonel Jeb Stewart's 1st Marine Tank Battalion. Major Gale quickly dispatched the Shermans to intercept the Japanese force. The Japanese tanks, lightly armored and outgunned, were no match for the Shermans' superior firepower. The 11th Marines, having moved a battery of 75mm pack howitzers into position, joined in, shredding the advancing Japanese tanks and foot soldiers alike. One Sherman, although damaged, continued firing and destroyed at least 6 Japanese tanks within minutes. Marine historian George McMillan later described the scene as something like a comic opera, but we knew how differently it could have ended had the Shermans arrived only a few minutes later. Amidst the chaos, mortar and artillery fire continued to pound our lines, relentlessly damaging our ranks. News soon reached us that Major Robert M. Ashe, our executive officer, had been killed on the beach that morning shortly after landing. Later, near dusk, our battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Austin Shifty Schaffner, was gravely wounded when a shell struck our command post. Schaffner, known for his toughness, had once escaped Japanese capture in Corregidor and was determined to fight. His injuries, however, forced his evacuation to a hospital ship, and Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Silent Lou Walt was ordered to take command. Walt, finding radio communications with our scattered companies unreliable, personally reached out to our commanders, eventually forming a defensive perimeter by nightfall. The tension that night was palpable as we held our positions, ammunition running low, and the newer replacements out of water. "What's going to happen tonight, Mac?" Private First Class Seymour Levy asked me anxiously. "Are the Japanese going to pull a banzai charge?" I tried to reassure him, though I had my own fears. "If they do, they'll make plenty of noise. Just keep your rifle and K-bar ready for any infiltrators sneaking through." It was a quiet night in our area, eerie enough that we could hear men praying softly along the line. I murmured a few Our Fathers myself, bracing for whatever dawn might bring. The quiet didn't last everywhere. At the 5th Marines headquarters, enemy shells struck, injuring Colonel Harold Bucky Harris and killing one of his staff. Major Walter Maloney, a decorated officer from Guadalcanal, was also wounded and evacuated. As dawn broke on D+1, Lieutenant Beamet approached, readying us for the next move. "It's time to do what we came here for," he said, "and capture that damn airfield." Our orders were clear: secure the airfield. This was set to be one of the largest coordinated ground assaults in the Pacific War. The entire 5th Regiment was to storm across the airfield, flanked by elements of the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines to our left, and the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines, advancing on our right. In total, nearly 4,500 Marines would charge in unison. The airfield lay bare, littered with shell craters and the charred remains of Japanese planes, offering us little cover. The coming assault would be fierce and unforgettable, testing each of us to our limits as we pushed forward in one of the defining battles of the Pacific Campaign. As we moved across open ground, fully exposed to enemy fire, it was clear that this wasn't just a drill, it was the real thing. "Do this just like we practiced on Pavuvu," Lieutenant Beamet barked. "Stay down until I give the signal, then move in a crouch. Don't stop for anything, and keep some space between yourself and the others." I nodded, passing his orders to the men, but a sinking feeling gripped me. The fear was undeniable. And as luck would have it, at that very moment, I felt an urgent call of nature, one that couldn't wait. Suddenly, Bamid's command to advance ripped through the air. With his pistol raised high, he yelled, "Move out!" We surged forward, breaking into scattered formations just as we'd been instructed. Almost instantly, Japanese artillery and machine guns from the ridges north of the field zeroed in on us, filling the air with dirt and smoke. Tracer bullets zipped past and shells exploded all around. I caught sight of Private First Class Sterling Mace and Seymour Levy running beside me, while Corporal John Tesvich was slightly ahead. Then I saw Private Dan Lawler from our machine gun squad fall, clutching his leg in pain. I kept yelling, "Keep moving, don't stop." But I knew I couldn't follow my own command much longer. I had to stop. Right there, in the open on the runway, I dropped down for a desperate moment, barely noticing as bullets smacked the tarmac around me. 30 agonizing seconds later, I scrambled back up, yanked up my pants, and bolted forward, hoping I hadn't just signed my own death warrant. The feeling of vulnerability was terrifying, especially knowing that we couldn't even see the enemy. They were concealed in the ridges and hidden behind bunkers and caves that we would later call Bloody Nose Ridge. The terrain was unforgiving, steep cliffs, narrow ravines, and ridges honeycombed with fortified caves. The Japanese had spent years turning this place into a fortress, and their gunners were well hidden. By the afternoon of D+1, we'd managed to capture the airfield, but at a steep cost. 7 men from our unit were dead, and over 24 were wounded. Remarkably, though, we'd kept casualties lighter than expected, largely because the dust and smoke from the relentless shelling obscured the Japanese view of us, and our thin spread reduced the effectiveness of their fire. Marine historian Eugene Sledge later described the experience of crossing that airfield as terror beyond belief. For days we struggled to secure it, all while enduring continuous shelling from Japanese artillery dug into the maze of ridges to the north. We knew that taking control of the airfield would mean endless bloody battles through the labyrinthine defenses above, where our enemy lay waiting to ambush us from hidden caves. Unlike earlier in the war, the Japanese here didn't rely on banzai charges or frontal assaults. Instead, they used the island's harsh terrain to their advantage, digging in deep, committed to taking as many of us with them as they could. It became clear that we'd have to root them out one brutal cave at a time, a process that would cost countless lives. Among the regiments, none suffered more initially than Chesty Puller's 1st Marines. Landing on the treacherous white beaches, they faced relentless resistance and some of the worst enemy fire, especially as they moved into the infamous ridges north of the airfield. Within days, the 1st Marines had lost over 500 men, killed or wounded. While Puller had earned respect for his command at Guadalcanal, where he heroically defended Henderson Field, his repeated assaults against these fortified positions on Peleliu led to massive losses. Many Marines grew critical of his tactics, though few could deny his courage and dedication. Captain George Hunt's K Company, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, faced one of the most grueling tasks, securing the Point, a rocky outcrop that overlooked White Beach 1 and had been fortified with Japanese guns that could sweep the entire landing area. Hunt's men managed to take it, an early but crucial victory that helped secure our beachhead. However, the cost was heavy, and they would continue fighting desperately in the following days. Peleliu would soon become one of the most punishing battles in the Pacific. Every inch we gained was drenched in sweat and blood, as we fought an enemy deeply entrenched and determined to die defending their positions. Capturing and holding Hill 100 was a remarkable yet grueling achievement for Captain Everett Pope and his men. What began as a successful charge quickly transformed into one of the bloodiest struggles in Marine Corps history. Over 2 harrowing days, Pope and a handful of remaining Marines fought off relentless Japanese assaults, leaving the ground littered with enemy bodies. They were finally relieved, but not before enduring a ferocious battle for survival. In my view, legendary Marine leader Chesty Puller can't be entirely blamed for the heavy casualties suffered by the 1st Marines on D-Day and D+1. They had landed directly into a Japanese stronghold, and many of their losses were unavoidable. However, in the days following the initial landing, Puller's relentless orders took a toll. With the beaches secured, Puller continued to push his exhausted troops through the ridges north of the airfield, sending battered companies back into combat despite their severe lack of manpower and resources. One of the most tragic examples was Company C of the 1st Battalion, commanded by Captain Everett Pope, a close friend and former college classmate of Captain Haldane of K Company. Pope's unit had suffered extreme losses on the beaches, with nearly two-thirds of his original 235 men killed or seriously wounded. On September 19th, D+4, Pope and his remaining 90 men were ordered to take a rocky outcrop known as Hill 100. However, this map designation proved misleading. Hill 100 wasn't a standalone hill, but rather part of a long, jagged ridge dominated by higher points that were crawling with Japanese defenders, armed with rifles, machine guns, mortars, and even artillery. Pope and about 25 of his men reached the top of Hill 100, a space scarcely bigger than a tennis court with minimal cover, only to find themselves surrounded by enemy forces. They were critically short on ammunition and armed with just a few M1 rifles, a couple of Tommy guns, some Browning automatic rifles, and 1.30 caliber machine gun. They were without radio contact, and their machine gun and mortar squads had been left behind during the climb. As night fell, they prepared for a battle of desperation. To hold their ground, Pope instructed his men to gather rocks. When the Japanese attempted to climb the hill, they'd throw rocks to simulate grenades, followed by real grenades to keep the enemy guessing. Through the night, brutal hand-to-hand combat erupted on Hill 100 as the Marines fended off Japanese attacks with whatever they had: rocks, knives, rifle butts, and even bare fists. By dawn, only 9 of the 25 Marines who had reached the summit were still alive, most of them wounded. The fighting left Pope's men physically and emotionally spent. Finally, orders came through for Pope to withdraw, but his radio operator was killed by Japanese machine gun fire on the way down. As Pope himself narrowly escaped further injuries, he found shelter behind a stone wall, pulling shrapnel from his leg with a pair of pliers. By September 22nd, a week after landing on Peleliu, the 1st Marines were finally pulled off the front lines, having sustained more than 1,600 casualties, 56% of their strength. Among the company commanders, only Captain Pope remained alive and unwounded. Despite his leadership during the war, Puller's reputation took a hit after the costly battle for Peleliu. Historian George Macmillan later described him as a tragic caricature of Marine aggressiveness who crossed the line between courage and needless loss of life. Captain Pope was awarded the Medal of Honor for his bravery and strategic skill on Hill 100, yet he never forgave Puller for sending his men into such dire circumstances. "I had no use for Puller," Pope would later admit. "He didn't know what was going on, and why he wanted me and my men dead on top of that hill, I don't know." After the airfield's capture, the 5th Marines continued their advance through dense jungle and swamp toward the east coast of Peleliu in an area designated as Purple Beach. Unlike the fierce combat faced by the 1st and 7th Marines in the hills, the 5th encountered minimal resistance. The Japanese seemed to be holding back, using hit-and-run tactics to delay our advance while setting up ambushes. On the morning of September 17th, D+2, my platoon was moving through a thick jungle thicket when we stumbled upon decomposing Japanese bodies, casualties of pre-invasion bombardments. The tropical heat had hastened the decay, and the stench was overpowering. We hurried to move away, but suddenly an explosion ripped through the air, sending us diving for cover. "What the hell was that?" yelled Private First Class Sterling Mace, his Browning automatic rifle at the ready. "Sounded like a grenade or maybe a booby trap," I replied, just as someone else shouted, "We got a man down, Corpman." Mace and I pushed through the underbrush, bracing ourselves for whatever lay ahead. As we moved through the jungle, we spotted Private First Class Seymour Levy kneeling a few yards away, holding his face with both hands. Blood ran down his neck, and he seemed disoriented, mumbling words we couldn't quite hear. Sterling Mace rushed to him, asking, "What happened, Levy?" But Levy didn't respond, still in shock. A fellow Marine quickly covered Levy's chin with a field dressing, noting, "There's shrapnel in there, looks like multiple fragments. He needs to get to the aid station, maybe even a hospital ship." While we waited for a stretcher, Levy, barely conscious, continued to bleed but had narrowly escaped serious injury, with the shrapnel missing his jugular vein by mere inches. "Hey, cheer up, buddy," Mace tried to reassure him. "That looks like $1 million wound to me. Might be your ticket home." As Levy was evacuated, the platoon pressed forward, now more cautious about possible booby traps left by the Japanese. But I noticed Mace was unusually quiet, so I moved up beside him and asked, "Worried about your pal?" He sighed. "Nah, he'll be fine. Actually, I kinda envy him. But I'm gonna miss the guy, you know? I may never see that crazy bastard again." I shrugged and said, "Yeah, well, maybe not until after the war." For the record, we were both wrong. After only 10 grueling days on Peleliu, the surviving 1st Marines were pulled back to regroup. Meanwhile, the 7th Marines were also taking heavy losses as they cleared out fortified Japanese bunkers at the south end of the island. Among them, Private First Class Arthur J. Jackson, a 19-year-old bar gunner, earned the Medal of Honor after single-handedly eliminating 12 enemy pillboxes. With the toll on both regiments, it was clear that the 5th Marines' turn in the line was approaching. We weren't thrilled, but we understood it was our duty. Our company, K/3/5, had seen relatively few casualties so far, with only 37 men killed or wounded. By contrast, our sister company, K/3/1 of the 1st Marines, had lost a staggering 175 men. To avoid repeating those costly mistakes, the higher-ups planned a different approach. This time, the 5th Marines would spearhead the assault, taking a route that circled around to hit the Japanese defenses from behind. "We're heading to the north end of the island to strike from a new direction," Captain Haldane briefed us. "Trucks will take us to the coast road, but after that we're on foot through what they're calling Sniper Alley. Be sharp and stay safe." When I checked our map, I saw what he meant. The narrow west road passed within 300 yards of the Japanese stronghold on the Umur-Brogel Plateau, a maze of ridges that provided perfect cover for enemy snipers. With the ocean on one side and steep ridges on the other, it was a brutal exposed route where there was little chance for cover. Just as we were about to leave Purple Beach, a surprise awaited us. To everyone's astonishment, Seymour Levy showed up back in camp, his chin wrapped in white bandages. He still had difficulty speaking and eating, but seemed in good spirits. When Mace saw him, he could hardly believe it. "What are you doing here?" he laughed. "I thought you'd be on your way to the States by now," Levy mumbled through his bandages. "Snuck off the hospital ship, hitched a ride to the beach. Just wanted to be with the guys, where I belong." Mace shook his head, grinning. "Seymour, you're nuts. You know that?" Levy just gave a crooked grin beneath the bandages, then started reciting lines from a Rudyard Kipling poem as if nothing had happened. The night before we left, my buddy John Tesvich and I lay by our foxhole, talking over the battles we'd survived and imagining what we'd do after the war. "This one hasn't been so bad so far," John said. "And once we're done here, we're bound to go home. Even the Corps can't keep us in this forever." I laughed. "Damn right. First thing I'm doing when I get back to Pennsylvania, calling my friends, grabbing a beer, maybe getting into some trouble, but no way I'm going back to the coal mines." John chuckled. "Sounds like a plan. I just hope my old man doesn't get that $20,000 GI insurance. Japanese will have to step it up if he's going to collect." On the morning of September 25th, D+10, we packed our gear. Our time on Purple Beach was up, and this would be our last reprieve before diving back into combat on Peleliu. As we prepared to move out, we passed a column of weary men from the 1st Marines, dragging themselves down the road toward Purple Beach. They were on their way to board boats for Pavuvu, where they'd finally get some relief. I stopped for a moment watching them. Their uniforms were torn, caked with mud and blood, and their faces were empty, haunted. They trudged along like ghosts, and the sight of them sent a chill through me. "Man, look at those guys," Lieutenant Bauerschmidt muttered beside me, shaking his head. "You can tell they've been through hell." I'd been kind of envious that the 1st Marines were getting relieved while we weren't, I said. But seeing them now, I don't envy them at all. Don't envy us either, Bauerschmidt replied grimly. In a few days we might look just like them. The Japanese still have a strong grip on those ridges, and it's up to us to flush them out. Same enemy, same kind of terrain, just a new direction. We soon climbed into the trucks and headed toward the West Road, passing north of the airfield. It looked nothing like the battlefield we'd crossed under fire on D+1. The wreckage of Japanese planes and the cratered ground had been cleaned up, replaced with orderly rows of repaired runways and teams of Seabees and service personnel working calmly with heavy equipment. The airfield was now out of enemy mortar range, and soon our own planes would be taking off from there to support us. That was the most promising sight we'd seen in days, maybe even a hopeful sign that we weren't in this fight alone. Our convoy stopped a short way up the West Road where Army troops from the 321st Regiment, 81st Infantry Division were gathered. It was the first time we'd seen Army personnel on Peleliu. I asked a couple of them if they'd be heading north with us. "No way, man," one of them replied. "We're relieving the 1st Marines here. We're staying put." "Looks like we're hoofing it alone," my buddy John Tesvich said as we waited for the order to move out. "They're sending up some tanks to go with us," I replied, remembering something Bauerschmidt had told me. "Maybe we'll be able to hitch a ride." "Better than walking," John said, though we both knew that riding on a tank made you an easy target. Around midday, a platoon of Shermans arrived, and we got the order to move out. The road narrowed as we walked, flanked on one side by a rocky beach and on the other by the first of the ridges, thick with undergrowth. Perfect cover for any Japanese sniper bold enough to be that close. We could hear the chatter of Japanese machine guns echoing from the ridges, and occasionally we'd see tracer bullets arcing through the air above us. Sporadic rifle shots, much nearer, warned us that we were already in the enemy's sights. It wasn't long before the Japanese started picking us off one by one. Sometimes we'd see a Marine go stiff and drop before we even heard the shot. Although we couldn't see where the bullets were coming from, some of us would fire back into the brush, hoping to hit something. Despite my earlier reservations about tank riding, the heat and the strain of the march were wearing us down. When Bauerschmidt waved one of the Shermans over and gestured for some of us to climb on, Tesvich and I didn't hesitate. We climbed onto the platform to the left of the turret, putting it between us and the ridges. Alongside us were Privates Jesse Gu, Sterling Mace, and Seymour Levy. The tank had barely moved 30 yards when a rifle shot rang out from ahead and to the right. Instinctively, I ducked, turning to check on Tesvich beside me. For a moment, I thought he was ducking too, but then I realized he was doubled over, clutching his stomach. Blood seeped between his fingers, staining his uniform. A second shot rang out, and Goose screamed from the other side of the tank, "God, I'm hit! I'm hit!" "Stop the tank!" I shouted. "We've got 2 wounded men." We managed to get Tesvich down from the tank, and a medic arrived just in time. He took one look and shook his head, saying, "The bullet went straight through his intestines. Not much I can do." "Take care of Gu," I said, struggling to stay calm. His arms busted. I looked down at Tesvich, lying on the ground, his face pale and gray. The blood on his uniform spread rapidly, and he looked up at me with a faint smile, holding my gaze. "Guess I'm going to make my old man rich after all, Mac," he whispered, referring to the life insurance he'd once joked about. I wanted to say something comforting, but words failed me. The reality of war struck hard in that moment, a sharp reminder that survival was never guaranteed, no matter how tough or careful you were. We all knew that day that the road ahead was only going to get tougher. The ridges awaited us, and the Japanese had dug in deep. We pressed on, knowing that this brutal march was far from over. The fight for Peleliu would test every ounce of strength we had left. I couldn't bring myself to look at him. I was too choked up. I wondered if I should give him morphine from the needle-equipped tube we all carried, but he didn't seem to be in pain. He just lay there, fading. So I stayed beside him, watching the life slip away from his eyes. John Tesvich was gone within minutes. Mason Levy stayed with me too. Other Marines from K Company would pass by, glance at us, then quickly look away, each one reminded of how close they, too, might be to death. Tesvich and I had been in the same company since 1941. Seeing someone you've shared so many years with die right in front of you, just inches away, it leaves a mark on you, deep and permanent. We'd talked the night before about how maybe one day we'd get home. I had to push the thought away, cover him with a poncho, and force myself to move on. As we resumed the march, I glanced back one last time. His eyes were still open, and there was that faint, peaceful smile on his face. "We better get moving," I told Mason Levy, but I didn't look them in the eye. My throat was too tight to say much more. The battle for Peleliu is often overshadowed by larger, longer, and bloodier conflicts in the Pacific. Guadalcanal lasted 6 times as long. Okinawa claimed 20 times more lives. Iwo Jima involved thousands more American troops. Yet Peleliu remains uniquely horrific, a brutal landscape of impossible terrain, relentless heat, and nonstop violence. It was a savage, desperate 30-day struggle, with men fighting like animals, stripped of any remaining humanity, driven by nothing but the urge to survive or kill. It was a nightmare of constant slaughter, and looking back, the hardest part to accept is that the battle may have been unnecessary. Admiral William Halsey, who knew the strategic situation well, openly opposed the invasion. He was aware that the Japanese garrison on Peleliu was severely weakened, with few planes and little offensive capability. Even Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, initially approved the operation but later argued against it when he met with President Roosevelt and General MacArthur in Hawaii. However, MacArthur insisted that Peleliu be captured to secure the flank of his planned invasion of the Philippines. Roosevelt ultimately gave in. Only after the battle did many in Washington realize that Peleliu could have been bypassed altogether, leaving the garrison to wither without posing a serious threat. For those of us who fought there, it's a bitter truth to bear. The battle was grueling and, as we learned, strategically pointless. Former Minnesota Governor Harold Stassen, who served as Assistant Chief of Staff to Halsey and later as an advisor to President Eisenhower, called Peleliu a terrible mistake and a needless tragedy. That's hard to hear, especially when I think of the 1,252 Marines killed on that island and the 5,274 more who left a part of themselves behind in its mud and blood. Those were the hardest weeks of my life, worse than the siege at Guadalcanal, worse than the green hell of Cape Gloucester. Peleliu was raw, endless brutality every single day. We attacked the Japanese strongholds in the Umabrogul Pocket, using every weapon in our arsenal. We torched them with flamethrowers, pounded them with artillery, and lobbed grenades into their fortified caves. Planes dropped napalm from above, and bulldozers buried them alive. This tactic, called blowtorch and corkscrew, became our only way forward, a relentless drive to wipe them out. When they came at us in the night, we fought hand-to-hand, gouging eyes, smashing skulls with rocks, anything to stay alive. Some days we didn't feel like soldiers, but more like animals, barely clinging to what remained of our sanity. Japanese intelligence initially estimated their strength at around 10,900 troops, yet when the last of the fighting ended, only 30 Japanese soldiers came forward to surrender. They fought with a ferocity and desperation we could hardly understand. By then, the 1st Marines had been evacuated, and the 7th Marines were depleted from heavy losses. It fell to the 5th Marines to bear the full burden of clearing those ridges. Every day was a grueling slog uphill, always under fire from hidden Japanese positions, always inching forward on jagged cliffs, trying to evade crossfire. They shot at us from fortified caves, from angles we could barely identify. As we slowly advanced, more of us fell. My grief over John Tesvich's death was soon overtaken by the loss of other friends and comrades. It became an endless cycle of advancing, hearing a sniper's shot, and watching another Marine drop. We would fire back blindly, desperate to find the hidden sniper, and when we thought we'd found the enemy's den, we'd call in artillery or mortars to pound it. But the terrain on Peleliu was like nothing I'd ever seen. It twisted and turned, hiding snipers and machine gun nests in places you'd least expect. This was a battle against an enemy you couldn't see and against an unforgiving landscape that seemed to swallow up everyone and everything. Peleliu may not be as famous as other battles, but to those of us who fought there, it remains unforgettable. It tested us in every way, physically, mentally, and morally. It left scars that no passage of time will ever erase. Our artillery shells struggled to reach distant targets, and the hidden snipers picked us off relentlessly. A single sniper might kill or wound 3 or 4 Marines before we could pinpoint his position. Those 17 days on Peleliu left scars none of us would ever shake. By September 27th, D+12, Colonel Harold Bucky Harris, commander of the 5th Marines, assigned our entire 3rd Battalion to yet another amphibious landing. Major John Gustafson led our battalion K-35 in what would be my 4th amphibious assault in the Pacific. This time we were targeting a small coral island off Peleliu's northern coast called Ngecebus. Despite its size, it promised to be a tough fight, with its ridges laced with Japanese bunkers and fortified caves. The major told us we were expected to secure it within 24 hours. No reinforcements, no time to spare. Lieutenant Baines briefed us that afternoon, explaining that the Japanese had over 500 troops dug into fortifications, equipped with mortars, several 75mm guns, and large-caliber naval artillery. "Be ready for a hard fight," he warned. Up until that point, we hadn't faced many infiltrators, but that night, 2 Marines were killed by Japanese soldiers who crawled into their foxholes under cover of darkness. One Japanese soldier spoke flawless English, asking about a lost rifle before killing a Marine. It reminded me of the taunts we'd endured at Guadalcanal, where Japanese soldiers would shout across the Matano River, daring us to come closer. Those 2 deaths were a grim reminder of the brutality that lay ahead. The morning of September 28th, D+13, we gathered on a strip of sand at Peleliu's northern tip, where 30 amphibious tractors waited to carry us across the shallow strait to Ngecebus. 1,000 yards away, naval guns from the battleship Mississippi and heavy cruisers Denver and Columbus unleashed 16 and 14-inch shells, raising dense clouds of smoke and dust. Marine corsairs from VMF 104 strafed the beaches with machine guns, bombs, and rockets tearing into enemy positions. The sight was mesmerizing, even though we'd seen similar bombardments before and knew the Japanese would likely survive most of it. Still, it was reassuring to know we'd have so much support for this landing. Our division also sent 13 amphibious tanks, each equipped with a 75mm cannon and twin 50-caliber machine guns, to spearhead the assault. Just 2 weeks earlier, K/3/5 had landed on Peleliu with 1,000 Marines. Now we were down to about 700. The rest were casualties, men killed or wounded. Only God knew how many more we'd lose that day, but we were about to find out soon enough. At 9 a.m., the bombardment ceased, and our amphibious tanks led the way as we loaded onto the amphibious tractors, or Amtraks. The drivers revved their engines, and the Amtraks crept forward, moving like armored turtles toward the shore of Ngecebus. I took the 50-caliber machine gun on the right side of our Amtrak, but it jammed, forcing me to reload every few rounds. I kept firing as best I could, but I'm not sure how much good it did. Luckily, there was no immediate return fire from the Japanese, which was a relief since the Amtraks took nearly 6 minutes to cross the shallow water to the beach. When we finally reached Ngecebus, I realized everyone else had already disembarked. I jumped off the Amtrak and dashed after them. A Japanese pillbox stood directly in front of me. I hit the ground and lobbed a few grenades, but they fell just short. Corporal Thomas Baxter, known for his uncanny ability to spot concealed Japanese soldiers, crawled up beside me with a Marine armed with a bazooka and another with a flamethrower. Together, they neutralized the pillbox. 2 Japanese soldiers, engulfed in flames, stumbled out, and we ended their suffering with rifle fire. We broke through the Japanese defensive line, running past the bodies of dozens of enemy soldiers, likely killed by the corsairs' strafing runs. We took out a few machine guns with grenades and used the same combination of weapons to neutralize another pillbox. Our attack moved quickly, but every step felt charged with danger. As platoon guide, I was responsible for maintaining contact with the other units, which was no easy task on this chaotic, smoke-filled battlefield. The assault on Gesibus may not be as famous as other battles, but it was as fierce as anything we'd experienced. It was a day filled with explosions, rifle fire, and the relentless drive to push forward. For us, Peleliu and its outlying islands became symbols of endurance, of pushing through exhaustion, and of bearing the grief for our fallen comrades with every step forward. We fought not just for survival, but with the hope that our sacrifices would bring an end to this brutal war. As we advanced, we faced open ocean on our left flank, leaving only our right flank to secure. That side was covered by the 1st Platoon, stationed so close I could practically call out to them as easily as my own 3rd Platoon. Early on, I stumbled upon a Thompson submachine gun, pristine and loaded with around 100 rounds of ammunition, lying behind a small rock outcropping. It was probably left behind by Sergeant Tom Rigney of the 2nd Platoon, who had been killed in that area earlier that morning. Finding the weapon felt almost miraculous, a gift from above. I had trained on Tommy guns back at New River before the war, but hadn't fired one since. My M1 rifle was reliable, but with a Thompson in hand and plenty of ammo, I felt like a one-man fire team. However, I didn't have an endless supply of ammunition, and 100 rounds could vanish quickly in a firefight like this one. The machine gun and small arms fire blazing around us that morning was some of the heaviest I had seen in the Pacific. Thankfully, we had tanks providing crucial cover and support. Without them, I doubt we could have held our ground, much less flushed the Japanese from their pillboxes and caves. But there were also times when we had to turn the tables and come to the rescue of our tank crews. Shortly after finding the Thompson, I spotted a tank just ahead, with 25 or 30 Japanese soldiers swarming over it. The tank crew was clearly in danger. I glanced back and saw Private First Class Sterling Mace, Private First Class Bill Leiden, and a few other Marines nearby. Yelling over the deafening gunfire, I urged them to follow me to help the tankers. Luckily, the Japanese were too fixated on the tank to notice us approaching. At about 30 feet away, I fired my first long burst with the Thompson. Mace, Leiden, and the others opened up with their rifles at the same time, and Japanese bodies flew off the tank in every direction. A few Japanese were still clinging to the turret, trying to pry it open. I hit them with another burst from the Tommy, and they fell without firing back. In seconds, we had cleared every attacker off the tank, but some Japanese still twitched on the ground, possibly playing dead. "Let's make sure they're not faking it," I told the other Marines. "If any of them aren't visibly injured, finish them." After a quick volley of shots, we left only silent bodies behind. A Marine tank rolled up beside us shortly afterward, and the tank commander popped his hatch, smiling. "I saw what you guys did back there. Thanks for the help," he said, then handed me boxes of 45 caliber rounds for the Thompson. With enough ammo now to last me through several firefights, I thanked him and promised to make every shot count. Noticing that the rest of my platoon had moved up a hill on the left, I followed, testing the ammo to make sure it worked well in the magazine. Just then, Captain Haldane passed by and spotted me firing a few test rounds. "Go easy on that ammo," he cautioned. "You might need every last round." Embarrassed, I nodded. I'd almost forgotten how scarce ammunition could be and decided to save it for the toughest moments ahead. The rest of that day turned into an unending battle. Our main objective was a complex of hills filled with interconnected caves and fortified pillboxes, each one teeming with Japanese soldiers. The air was thick with bullets. When our advance slowed, I watched Gunnery Sergeant Pop Haney, a 50-year-old legend, rally the men with a shout, "Come on, let's move up!" He pushed us forward despite heavy fire, and we kept advancing up the hill. Alongside us, Private First Class Walter Stay was killed, and Corporal Richard Van Trump was evacuated after his lower jaw was blown away by enemy fire. I must have thrown 40 or 50 grenades that day, and had just as many hurled back at me. My Thompson got a thorough workout too. In one coordinated effort, our tanks would pull up, firing 75mm rounds straight into pillbox openings, while Marines with flamethrowers and bazookas moved in close to clear them out. Any Japanese who ran from cover were met with a spray from my Thompson. We repeated this deadly cycle again and again, a grim but effective process. Only fate could know how many enemies I took down that day, but our own ranks suffered too. One moment that stands out was when Bill Lydon and I spotted 4 or 5 Japanese soldiers emerging from a cave, grenades in hand. I dropped 2 with the Thompson, but others continued lobbing grenades toward us. Each step that day was a fight for survival, for each other, and for the chance to see an end to this brutal campaign. The ground was littered with reminders of the battle's intensity, and as night fell, the hill complex we had fought so hard to secure stood as a testament to the grit and sacrifice of those who had been there. He was a bold, reckless son of a gun. He charged straight toward Lien and yelled, "Kill me, Marine, kill me!" Without hesitation, Lien responded, firing a quick burst from his M1 rifle that took the Japanese soldier down. But in the instant he fell, the enemy soldier managed to throw a grenade, and the fragment struck Lien squarely in the face. It was a devastating blow. The last Japanese soldier, still standing, drew back his arm to toss another grenade at me. I acted fast, cutting him in half with a burst from my Thompson before he could release it. Lien's face was a bloody mess, especially around his left eye. It was clear he needed immediate medical attention. As soon as we could get a corpsman to him, he was evacuated to the rear. The last words I heard him say were a soft, anguished, "Oh, I think I'm blind." I said a silent prayer for him right there. Bill Lien was barely 18 years old. Though he had his moments of being a wisecracking kid, he was also a damn good Marine, one who fought with as much grit and determination as any man I had ever known. Later, after the war, I learned the medics had managed to save his eyesight. Bill recovered quickly enough to be wounded again, this time even worse at Okinawa, by a Japanese 75mm shell. But as always, he fought through it and lived to tell the tale. By dusk on September 28th, we had secured about 90% of the island of Inabus, with only a few small pockets of Japanese resistance left to clear out. We dug in for the night, leaving the mopping up for the following morning. It took us about an hour to deal with the last of the Japanese caves. I called in a bazooka man and a flamethrower, and then, to be absolutely certain that the caves were cleared, a demolition team moved in to seal the entrances with TNT charges. Once we were sure the area was secured, we handed over the rest of the cleanup duties to Army troops and began heading back to the beach. Our Amtraks were waiting to take us back to Peleliu. By the time we left Inabus, we had either killed or captured 470 out of the estimated 500 Japanese troops stationed there. It felt as though we had to kill the same Japanese soldiers several times over before they would finally stay down. In just over 30 hours of combat on Inabus, K3/5 had suffered nearly 2/3 of the 3rd Battalion's total casualties, 8 men killed and 24 wounded. We were met with a round of applause from division headquarters for the job we had done. Colonel Lou Walt, the overall commander of the operation, praised our tactics, while Major Gustafson, commanding officer of the 3rd Battalion, called our tank-infantry assault a model of perfect coordination. The division's battle diary summed up our victory on Inabus in this way: infantry and armor performed with ruthless efficiency unequaled in any previous Pacific operation. But we didn't get much time to enjoy our success. 2 days after finishing up on Inabus, we were sent into the heart of Peleliu's enemy-infested pocket, where we faced another 2 weeks of relentless around-the-clock combat. By the time Peleliu was fully secured, many more of K3/5's bravest Marines had given their lives. By early October, what remained of the 7th Marines was locked in a grueling stalemate with the Japanese on the Umur-Brogel southern ridges and along the West Road. Our lines were stretched thinner than tissue paper, and all we could do was hold the ground we had and prevent the Japanese from breaking through. Advances were measured in feet, sometimes in inches. In many places, our lines were within 10 or 12 yards of the enemy. There was no time to eat, no time to sleep, and no way to rest except during brief, infrequent lulls in the fighting. To break the Japanese grip on Peleliu's pocket, it was clear that the 7th Marines needed to be relieved by fresher troops. If the 1st Marine Division was going to succeed, it would be up to us in the 5th Regiment to make it happen. On the maps, the major ridges and rocky knobs had names like the Five Sisters, the Five Brothers, the Horseshoe, and the China Wall. But to us, they all looked the same, just more obstacles in an endless landscape of death. Behind every ridge we captured, there were 3 or 4 more waiting for us. They seemed to stretch on forever. Private First Class Sterling Mace came up with the best description I had ever heard when he said, "This terrain is like the surface of a waffle iron, only magnified 1,000,000 times." By this point, the stench of death hung thick in the air, suffocating us like an invisible fog. Our Marine pilot said the smell was so overpowering that even at 1,500 feet above Peleliu, it was unbearable. The Japanese had made no attempt to collect or bury their dead. They just left them where they fell to rot. I passed by one dead Japanese soldier, sitting up on a trail I walked often, and I must have shot his corpse a dozen times. Each time I rounded a bend, his body would be there, and without thinking, I'd fire a few rounds at him. Eventually, his corpse decomposed to the point that it no longer even looked human. I stopped shooting him. We took great pride in properly honoring our fallen comrades, but in the unforgiving terrain of the ridges, burying our dead became impossible. In one of the few instances in Marine Corps history, we had no choice but to leave our dead on the field for days, even weeks. Some of Chesty Puller's men killed on D+2 still hadn't been recovered by early October. The hundreds of decomposing bodies attracted huge swarms of blowflies. At times, they were so thick they blotted out the sun, and eating became an ordeal, as we had to fight the clouds of flies for every bite of food. If there was a Marine on Peleliu who didn't swallow a few flies with his sea rations, I never met him. The heat was relentless, often reaching 115 degrees Fahrenheit in the afternoons. In all of warfare's history, I don't think soldiers have ever fought under such brutal conditions. On October 1st, D+16, all 3 battalions of the 5th Marines piled into a convoy of trucks and Amtraks, heading toward a bivouac area south of the notorious Japanese stronghold known as the Five Sisters. Our first task was clear: eliminate a group of enemy snipers who had been terrorizing a section of the West Road, an area grimly dubbed Dead Man's Curve. This was the same stretch of road where just days earlier John Tesvich had lost his life and Jesse Gu had been severely wounded. We were determined to settle the score. As we disembarked from the trucks and began our cautious ascent up the jagged ridges east of the road, the familiar sound of gunfire echoed through the air. It wasn't intense or sustained fire, just the occasional shot, but every time it rang out, one of our Marines would go down. The Japanese had clearly been watching us unload, patiently waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It was unnerving how precise and deliberate their fire was. A single slip-up, a fraction of a second of exposure, and a Marine would drop, motionless. We had only just started moving up the ridge when the first shots rang out. My 3rd platoon was inching its way up a particularly jagged piece of terrain, and I mean inching. Every step was deliberate, every movement calculated. The silence had lasted for a few minutes, but something felt wrong. I could feel it in my gut. "Watch it now, guys," I warned my men. "There's no such thing as a comfort zone out here. Keep your heads down, take it slow, and stay safe." Private First Class Sterling Mace, who was crouching just to my left, was clearly itching to get some action. He had his Browning automatic rifle ready, but I trusted him to remain disciplined. He hadn't made a rash move yet. As he patiently stuffed his pockets with extra rounds, he glanced over to his buddy, Private First Class Seymour Levy, who had been quieter than usual since his chin wound. Levy hadn't even been spouting Kipling poetry, something he was known for. But despite his unusual silence, he seemed all right for the moment. "Hey, Cy, got room in your pack for this fresh pack of smokes? I don't want them getting squashed," Mace asked. Levy, as quiet as ever, simply nodded. "Sure," he replied, though his response was more terse than usual. I noticed the bandage on his chin still looked dirty, and it was hard to tell if he was smiling or grimacing. As Mace moved on down the line, the familiar sound of scattered shooting began again from the Japanese positions. It was then that I noticed something in Levy's eyes, an unease, a flicker of tension that I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Something bothering you, kid?" I asked, my voice low. Levy shrugged. "I guess I'm just edgy, Mac. I hate being pinned down like this. It feels like I'm trapped sometimes. I can't stand it." "Stay calm," I told him. "Just take it easy, keep your head down, and wait for your shot. Patience is key in situations like this. Just stay down and keep yourself safe." For a moment, it seemed like Levy regained his composure, striking up a quiet conversation with Corporal Tom Meany, a calm guy from our mortar section. I thought he was going to be fine, but then, just 3 or 4 minutes later, Levy snapped. Without warning, he jerked his rifle up and let out a primal yell. "I'm sick and tired of this," he shouted. "I can't take it anymore." And just like that, he sprang to his feet, running headlong into the line of fire. A Japanese bullet struck him almost instantly. I felt droplets of his blood splatter across my face as he collapsed in a heap. He never knew what hit him. Mace, who had been looking for his cigarettes, came rushing back down the line moments later, only to find 2 Marines risk their lives to drag Levy's lifeless body down the hill. When Mace learned of what had happened, his reaction was one of pure rage. "I'm going up there," he said, gesturing with his Browning automatic rifle toward the ridge above us. "I'm going to wipe out the whole damn bunch of them." "No, you're not," I said, grabbing him by the shoulders. "You're one of the best barmen in the platoon. I'm not letting you get yourself killed over this. Cool off, Mace. We need you. You've got to keep it together." Mace slumped to the ground, head lowered, frustration written all over his face. "But why'd he have to do it?" he muttered. "Why couldn't the damn fool just take his wound and go home?" "I don't know," I said quietly, "and now we'll never know." The battalion eventually called in artillery and mortar support, and Corsairs rained down napalm strikes, which helped break up the sniper nests and allowed us to regroup. But as we caught our breath, we knew that much worse awaited us. The fighting was far from over. On the morning of October 3rd, we launched a battalion-strength assault from the south against the Five Sisters, our version of the five-headed monster. For me, this would become one of the darkest days of the war. It was a day I would lose 3 more friends from my 3rd platoon, and K3/5 would suffer 20 casualties. Our attack was coordinated with a simultaneous strike from the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, who would assault the adjacent strip of high ground, now designated as Walt's Ridge, in honor of Colonel Lou Walt, the 5th Marines executive officer. This was the 2nd time Walt had been so honored, but the reality of the situation was stark. This hill, Hill 100, was the same one where Captain Everett Pope's men had taken devastating losses just 2 weeks earlier, highlighting how little ground we had gained in the brutal battle for this island. The battle for Peleliu was one of the most grueling and disheartening campaigns in the Pacific Theater, and the relentless Japanese pockets of resistance that held firm throughout the fight made the conflict feel like an endless cycle of futility and death. Day after day, we found ourselves attacking the same ridges, only to gain little ground and suffer horrific casualties. The enemy's positions were so well entrenched that we seemed to be stuck in an endless loop of assault, retreat, and repeat. On the morning of October 3rd, we began our advance with a network of ridges rising up to our left. To our right, the open expanse stretched all the way to the airfield and our original beachhead. But as we made our way up the slopes, the fire from Japanese caves and pillboxes high above us was intense. The Japanese had dug in deep, and despite our efforts, we couldn't root them out completely. The tanks we had with us could only fire at the enemy from a distance because the terrain was too rugged for them to get close. Most of the morning was spent using bazookas, flamethrowers, and TNT charges to try to eliminate the enemy positions, but we missed some, leaving ourselves vulnerable. As we pressed forward, the situation grew increasingly dangerous. The enemy fire was coming at us from both the front and the rear, creating a deadly crossfire. They're behind us! I heard a Marine yell as the bullets started flying. Lieutenant Bill Bowers Schmidt, only a few yards from me, was suddenly struck in the belly by a Japanese rifle shot. I turned just in time to see him crumple to the ground, blood soaking his uniform. As I crawled toward him, I was struck by the horrifying similarity to what had happened to Tesvich just days earlier. It was the same type of wound in the same area. Schmidt was already covered in blood, his legs lifeless, but he was still desperately trying to pull his .45 pistol from its holster. "I don't get it," he mumbled weakly. "The shot came from behind. Are our own men shooting at us?" "No, sir," I replied, though my voice was barely a whisper. We must have missed some of them. But by then, Schmidt was unconscious, and a few moments later he was dead. He was a man I admired deeply, an outstanding platoon leader and a good friend. He treated us all like equals, never acting superior, and it pained me deeply to see him go. But in the chaos of war, there was no time to mourn. There was only one thought in my mind. We had to move, or we would all die here. I yelled at the men around me to fall back down the hill. "We can't hold here," I said, urging them to retreat to safety. We lost 2 more Marines as we tried to withdraw. Private First Class Lyman Rice was killed instantly as he tried to retreat, and Private First Class Raymond Groet was cut down when he ran too far out into the open. Groet, just 18 years old, was one of those daredevils who always thought he could pull off the impossible, but this time he made a fatal mistake. The battle wasn't done with us yet. As I tried to return to a safer position to grab my pack, a Japanese soldier threw 5 grenades in my direction. 2 of them exploded just a few feet from me, but by sheer luck, I was able to hunker down in a ditch without a scratch. At the same time, I carried my Tommy gun, but I dared not return fire, as I would have been shooting directly toward the K-3/5 command post. Meanwhile, the Japanese began targeting our stretcher bearers, who were struggling to move the wounded. One bearer was killed by a grenade and another was wounded. Corporal Charles Williams, who served as our company bugler, was dangerously exposed, and I had to drag him to the ground to save him from a similar fate. It was one of the worst days we had faced on Peleliu, and it was far from over. By the end of October 3rd, K-3/5 had suffered a total of 20 killed and wounded. The next day, October 4th, was slightly less brutal, but the carnage continued. We sustained 8 more casualties, including Private First Class Alan Moore, who was killed in action. One Marine, Private First Class Ray Rottinghouse, a tough farm boy from Iowa, fired nearly 500 rounds from his Browning automatic rifle, taking out more than a dozen Japanese soldiers in the open. But then, from a nearby pillbox, a machine gun opened up on him. One bullet severed his left index finger and shattered the stock of his rifle. Despite his injuries, he calmly wrapped his shirt around his mangled hand and started toward an aid station. Halfway there, stretcher bearers convinced him to let them carry him the rest of the way. By nightfall on October 4th, K-3/5's 2-day casualty total had risen to 28, more than 20% of our total strength just 48 hours earlier. Meanwhile, the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines, was faring even worse. L Company lost its commanding officer, Captain James J. Mo Shanley, who had been awarded a Navy Cross for his actions at Cape Gloucester, and its executive officer, Lieutenant Harold Collins, both within seconds of each other. They were caught in a savage crossfire while trying to retreat from Hill 120, a jagged outcropping that had already claimed many lives. Only 11 of the 48 men who attacked the hill survived, and 6 of them were wounded. October 5th brought more grim news. General Geiger, commander of the 3rd Amphibious Corps, ordered the remaining troops of the 7th Marines to be pulled off the front lines and prepared for evacuation. By that point, the regiment had lost 1,486 men, 46% of its authorized strength. Both L and I companies, which had initially landed on Peleliu with 235 men each, were all but decimated. What had seemed like an unyielding island fortress was slowly claiming the lives of our bravest men, and with each passing day, the brutal reality of war became clearer. This would not be an easy victory. General Rupertus continued to argue with General Geiger, holding on to the hope that the battle for Peleliu could still be won with just a little more time. "Give them a little more time," he insisted. "They'll take the pocket and the battle will be over." But Rupertus was fooling himself. The truth was, the 7th Marines were utterly spent, too worn out to sustain any kind of offensive action. It was a grim reality that every field officer in the regiment understood, yet Rupertus, much like Chesty Puller had 2 weeks earlier, seemed to have his head buried deep in the sand. Though over 95% of Poliliu was now under Allied control and the Japanese were contained in an area not much larger than half a dozen football fields, the heart of the Japanese defensive pocket remained unbroken. Those of us out there on the line knew the bitter truth. It was far from over, and it would take far more death and suffering before we could truly claim victory. We were still far from achieving the kind of breakthrough needed to wipe out the remaining enemy forces. The men who had been fighting in the pocket for weeks, like myself, were only too aware that more casualties, our casualties, were inevitable. It wasn't until late on the morning of October 6th that Rupertus finally relented. Exhausted, beaten, and broken by the realities on the ground, he gave the order to withdraw the remaining survivors of the 7th Marines. If Poliliu was going to be finished, it would now fall to the 5th Marines to complete the job. We were the last ones left. The conditions on the island were nightmarish and getting worse every day. The stench of decay filled the air, not just the odor of the bodies of the fallen, but also the growing pile of human waste that was accumulating everywhere. The harsh, rocky ground made it impossible to build latrines, and with no place to bury our own waste, it began to pile up, growing worse with each passing day. Even if many of us had still had an appetite, we probably wouldn't have been able to stomach food given the environment. I personally never recall being truly hungry during the battle. Fighting off the flies for every bite of food became exhausting, and I often went 2 or 3 days without eating. As a result, large amounts of food were wasted, which only added to the growing miasma of unpleasant smells. Sleep was a distant memory. We fought through the days like zombies, half delirious from exhaustion. At night, the Japanese were always close, too close, lurking in the darkness just feet away. The tension was unbearable. The Japanese infiltrators wore black pajamas and rubber-soled shoes, making them nearly invisible and completely silent as they crept into our lines under the cover of night, eager to catch us off guard. I was lucky enough to avoid direct encounters with them, but many of my comrades weren't so fortunate. As the final days of the battle wore on, I could barely keep my eyes open. I would position myself with my back to a rock wall, rifle or Tommy gun in hand, and my bayonet within reach, always ready for the next ambush. I couldn't afford to think of home or anything comforting for fear of falling asleep. The fatigue and stress became overwhelming, and some of the men began to crack under the pressure. I heard of soldiers who, in their desperation, would stretch out their arms or legs into the open during firefights, hoping to get wounded and evacuated. Though I never witnessed such a thing firsthand, I'm certain it happened. The constant threat of death, the endless stress, and the deprivation had pushed many of us to the edge. Looking back, I still can't fathom how any of us survived those final days, but miraculously a few of us did. One of the biggest reasons we made it out alive was the leadership of Colonel Bucky Harris. Under his command, the 5th Marines were fortunate not to be sent on suicidal missions, like some of the other units who had been ordered to charge directly into well-fortified Japanese caves. Instead, Harris took a more measured approach. He understood the importance of patience, and he called in artillery, tanks, mortars, and air support to soften up the enemy positions before sending in the infantry to clear them out with flamethrowers, bazookas, and explosives. I firmly believe that many of us in K/3/5 who survived Poliliu owe our lives to Colonel Harris. Had I been in the 7th Marines, I'm convinced I would have been among the dead by the second week of October. By October 10th, the Japanese snipers positioned along the ridges above the West Road were still a constant threat. They were nearly impossible to see, firing from well-concealed one-man positions scattered across the terrain. Every attempt to move along that road was met with deadly fire, and we found ourselves engaged in a frustrating, never-ending battle to root them out. K/3/5, along with 6 or 7 tanks, was sent in to try once more to eliminate the snipers in the area where our comrade John Tesvich had been killed. By this point, the company's casualty rate had risen to over 40%, and 1st Platoon, now under the leadership of Lieutenant Hill Bucky Jones, had been reduced to just 15 riflemen, half its normal strength. Jones, who had been wounded in the hand days earlier but had insisted on staying on the front lines to treat his own injury, was a calm and level-headed officer, but the toll of the battle had begun to weigh heavily on him. The constant casualties were taking their toll on everyone. That morning, the snipers took their time, picking off their targets with chilling precision. Private First Class. Charles McClary was hit in the stomach, much like Tesvich had been, and died shortly after. Within minutes, 2 other men were seriously wounded. Jones was under immense pressure. If the snipers continued to take out his platoon at this rate, the entire unit could be wiped out before the day was over. Despite his personal anguish over the losses, Lieutenant Jones remained focused on the task at hand. But the stress and the weight of the losses were clearly wearing him down. This was no longer a fight for survival, it was a fight against despair. As the day wore on, Lieutenant Hill Bucky Jones, known for his calm demeanor and steady leadership, found himself crouched behind one of the tanks, gripping his Tommy gun tightly. He was peering through binoculars, trying to locate the Japanese snipers that had been causing chaos from their concealed positions along the ridge. It had been a frustrating battle, one of many in the brutal campaign for Peleliu, and Jones knew that if they didn't do something soon, the sniper fire would continue to chip away at his men, pushing them closer to the brink. Major Clyde Brooks, a staff officer from the 3rd Battalion headquarters, came running up, seeking Jones's counsel. Brooks had been sent by Major Gustafson to help deal with the sniper problem, but he knew they needed a more effective strategy. Taking cover next to Jones, Brooks asked, "Got any ideas?" Without hesitation, Jones nodded. "I'm thinking of climbing up on this tank to spot a target for the gunners. They'll have a better chance of hitting something with the machine gun or the 75mm cannon than we do with rifles from down here." Brooks frowned, clearly concerned about the risk. "Sounds like a damn risky move." Jones, ever the pragmatist, replied with a grim chuckle, "Yeah, but it's either that or we sit here in this damn shooting gallery all day." After a moment of silence, Brooks gave a reluctant nod. "All right, give it a try, but watch yourself." Jones left his Tommy gun behind. It was useless at the range the snipers were firing from. With determination, he climbed up onto the rear deck of the tank, then tapped on the turret to get the tank commander's attention. "I'm going to try to find you a target for your .50 caliber or your 75, he shouted, "so be ready." "Are you sure you want to do this?" Brooks called out from his cover, his voice laced with concern. "So far, so good," Jones replied with a shrug. "Yeah, so far, so good." Those were the last words anyone would hear from Jones. As he peered around the turret to scan the ridge, a sharp crack of gunfire split the air. A sniper's bullet hit Jones in the left side, just below his ribs. He staggered, falling backward off the tank and crashing onto the rocky ground below. A cry went out for a corpsman, but to the shock of everyone watching, Jones slowly pulled himself to his feet. Bleeding heavily, his shirt soaked with blood, he somehow staggered back to the tank. Despite the excruciating pain and the dizziness from blood loss, he climbed back onto the tank's rear deck, determined to fulfill his duty. But before he could stand, a second shot rang out. This time, the bullet struck him directly in the heart. The man who had embodied leadership, courage, and compassion, described by Eugene Sledge in his memoir as a unique combination of bravery, integrity, and straightforwardness, was gone. The loss of Hill Bucky Jones hit every man in the company hard. His leadership had been a guiding light in the hellish days of combat, and his death left a void that no one could fill. The snipers continued their relentless attacks throughout the rest of the day, their small arms fire and mortar rounds causing more casualties. But the following morning, the battalion ordered an overwhelming response. Tanks, artillery, mortars, and aircraft, especially the Corsairs, bombarded the ridge relentlessly. The area was reduced to rubble, and after hours of bombardment, the sniping from that particular position finally stopped. But the fighting didn't end there. The battle for Peleliu raged on, and the toll of death and suffering continued to mount. The Marines were worn thin, but they pushed forward, driven by the memory of their fallen comrades, including the brave officer they had lost that day.